Today we're going to move on to looking at mostly catching, but bear in mind that there are other reception skills. So I have to receive the ball in soccer or in field hockey. Okay. So catching's the most common, and it's the reception skill we know the most about. So ideally, particularly in a game scenario, catching wants to be with our hands, fingers. We want to be able to manipulate that ball. Often after the catch, we have to throw and get rid of the ball, right? So it's not always about catching and holding on to the ball. Okay. So catching from a stationary position, like we will do with the children on the playground, makes it a little more simple. As soon as you add movement into it, it becomes much more complicated, because now the brain has to intercept the object, right? Even catching standing still is quite difficult for the brain to work out where to put the hands, right? If I add then that the person is moving, it becomes hugely complicated. So catching is biomechanically simpler than throwing. Throwing is a very complicated skill from a mechanical point of view, but from a perceptual point of view and a learning point of view for the brain, catching is way more difficult. When we're looking at younger children, not even our tiny kids, even if you're looking at elementary and early middle school kids, the catch is often down to the fact that it was a really good throw, rather than it was a good catch, right? Right, so early catching, those of you that are in lab will recognize some of these characteristics from MSU and TGMB. Right, early catching, stationary individual, usually arms and hands are just out straight, and if they're lucky and the throw was good enough, they might grab the ball with their arms and trap it against their chest. There's not a lot of force absorption going on, right? Occasionally you'll see children shut their eyes as the ball is coming towards them, or they might even turn their head away. And we'll come back and talk about that idea a lot more when we get to the sensory perceptual information that's coming up after the next exam. Okay. But that movement of the ball towards the face, the eyes initially, when the child is learning or the individual is learning, that makes the brain go, ooh, right? So we quite often will see that behavior in people who are not comfortable with catching. You might even see it in adults who are not comfortable with catching. Proficient catching, so we've got some experience now. We've been practicing a little bit. My brother or sister's been throwing the ball to me, or we have a teacher that is making an effort to use balls in the playground or even in the classroom. And so we're getting some practice. And now what we would see is that instead of the arms being out there, so stage 1 is arms, stage 2 is arms, stage 3 is arms, gets to stage 4 on our lab assessments before we see the hands be involved. Right? So for proficient catching, when we look at this development, The hands would be out, ready to make contact with the ball, and if they make contact, they are able to give, and the brain has learned this idea of trying to absorb the force of the ball that's moving through the air. Also, the individual will be able to move around and judge where the ball is going to be. And if the ball is high, they'll have their hands placed up high, and if it's down low, they'll be able to make that adjustment and move their hands down low. So the brain is understanding the trajectory of the ball there. So we do have in the book a developmental sequence and an observation plan for catching. So some of these characteristics are not validated. They're suggested by people who have a lot of experience with motor development and with the skill of catching. So they're pretty dependable, okay? So your developmental sequence for catching is on page 196. And what they have suggested is 3 components for catching, all right? They have an arm action, a hand action, and a body kind of feet action. All right? So the developmental sequence gives us some detailed description to give us the picture that we would be looking for each step. Right? Remember that on this observation plan on our developmental sequence, we're creating a developmental set of stages for each component that we think is important for the skill. Okay? So from the developmental sequence, they developed an observation plan that is easier to use than the developmental sequence, because the developmental sequence has loads of words on it, right? And it gives me a good picture, but then when I'm standing there looking at someone, I want something that's a yes, no, or a quick check to do, okay? So the observation plan is the hands-on useful tool version of the sequence. Okay. So for our arm action, there we go. First question, do the arms move to adapt to ball arrival? Yes or no? Right. If it's no, then the arm action is categorized as step 1. There's not a lot of response going on with the arms. Okay. If the answer is yes, that's not the end of the picture, so I have to ask another yes-no question. Okay. So the next question is the ball trapped against the chest or caught in the hands? Okay. So are they catching it, scooping it, hugging it, or are they making contact with their hands first before their arms? Okay. So if it's trapped, they actually change the format slightly, because if it's trapped, then they want to find out some more about it. Okay. So if it's trapped, are they hugging it or are they scooping it? Okay. So we've got step 1, step 2, step 3. If, bless you, if they're not catching with their arms, they're catching with their hands, that's step 4, and that's the highest level for fundamental catching. And we're not looking at this as a sport skill, bless you. This is fundamental catching. What do we expect preschoolers, kindergartners, elementary children to be doing? Okay. So step 4, we've got hand, make contact, and the arms are giving a little bit. And then they do the same idea for the other 2 components. So we've got hand action, questions, yes, no, and we've got body action, do they move? to meet the ball. If it's no, they're standing still, they're stationary. Right? So this idea is what we're going to do on Wednesday in class. All right? So tomorrow, I strongly suggest you take a little bit of time to look at these observation plans in your textbook so that you're ready to have a go at creating your own in class on Wednesday. All right? So what are the kinds of things the brain is trying to make decisions on here? All right? What makes catching so complicated? There's a lot of variety in the constraints to start with. That complicates things. I might have a rugby-shaped ball, or I might have a really hard ball like a baseball or a cricket ball, or I might be catching something that's softer and is going to give when I touch it. Right? Where is the ball going to be? So I have to actually understand direction and speed. How hard is the ball coming? What do I have to be prepared to absorb force-wise if I make contact with the ball? Do I understand how much force there's likely to be that I've got to take in? Right? Because if I don't absorb it, the ball's going to bounce back out again. Right? I've got to be able to move with it and absorb that force. Does that make sense? Can you put your foot up?
No. Thanks.
I'm missing slides. Okay, I'm going to flip through. Apparently, I did not reorder. Ah, there it is. Oh, okay. Let's do it that way around. That makes it easy. All right. So if I'm going to be assessing catching, then I really have to pay attention to particularly my task constraints, but also possibly the environmental constraints. All right? If I am going to do a pre-assessment on catching, because I'm going to run a unit on catching with my PE students, or if I'm running a low-level summer camp for kids, I'm going to run a pre-assessment on how good they are so I know which group to put them into, okay? So then when I run the post-assessment, I have to be very careful that I keep the constraints consistent across time. Not during the practice. They don't have to be consistent during the practice. But I can't test someone with a great big ball at the beginning and then test them with a little small ball at the end because I know they got better at catching across the practice sessions. Then I can't compare those two assessments. All right? So I have to keep the size of the ball consistent. I have to keep the type consistent. I've got to keep the distance that I am tossing the ball from consistent. And as much as possible, the I can't say that with these on, trajectory consistent. All right?
So would you test them with the small ball before and then after, and then after you test them, go to the big ball?
Yeah, I probably would. I think that's the most truthful version because, as we'll talk about in a little bit, what I want to see, good catching uses the hands. So I would use a small ball and it would probably not do well, but then hopefully with all the different kinds of practice, when I use a small ball at the end, maybe they'll be more successful. Yeah, good question. So those are all task constraints. You might also consider the environmental constraints. If I run the pre-test outside on the grass and it's not slippy, right? right? And then I run the post-test inside on a shiny gym floor because now it got too cold to be outside. That could possibly impact. It's going to have less impact on catching than it might on some other skills, but still, if the kid is not confident in their foothold on a shiny floor, it might change their behavior a little bit. Okay. Then I have to decide what is it I'm scoring, right? And we talked about this previously, the difference between the process and the product, all right? I can literally count how many catches they make, right? So I give them 10 attempts and they get 5. And that's a product measure. But that doesn't tell me what they're doing when they're missing the ball or catching the ball. Right? So my other option is to use something like my developmental sequence, my observation plan, or my MSU chart, my TGMD, or there are some other versions of assessments out there, right? And I can do a process assessment that tells me what they're actually doing at the time that I can correct with the practice. Right? How do I know which types of practice to set up if I don't know what needs correcting? If all I know is they caught the ball 5 times, then how do I know what to set up in order to practice catching? Because I've got to be flexible and creative with my stations. So when we look at older adults and catching, we have, as usual, not very much research available. So it's reasonable to assume that catching could be influenced by various structural constraints. Right? So if they are a little bit slower than they were 20 years ago, or if they've got arthritis in their shoulder or their elbows or even their fingers, right, then that might affect their ability to reach and close down on the ball in time to make the catch. Experience is going to balance that somewhat. So someone who plays a lot of ball games as they get older and keeps practicing and keeps experiencing catching, then they're going to have a good idea about the relationship between when and how do I have to move to be in the right place. Or they might be able to anticipate early, oh, the ball's going that way. If I go now, even though I'm slow, I might get there in time. Coincidence anticipation tasks are usually run in a lab situation, and they involve activities where the job is to know where the target is, see something move, and get to the target first. It's usually a hand movement type task. The lab activities and most of the research on anticipation and interception is not very real world, unfortunately. So you have to be a little bit wary when you're reading the research, because I have a lot of control in the lab about what is happening. We don't have any control in the middle of a game about what is happening, right? We do see improvement if we give developmentally appropriate practice activities for older adults. So, again, if you're going to work in a rec center, what are you going to do during the day in your rec center? Can you open up activities for the retired population who aren't at work? rather than leave the rec center pretty empty until the kids come in after school? Can we create more opportunities for movement for the elderly population in our communities? So, as always, our book is embedded in this triangle, our constraints triangle. And catching is very sensitive to constraints. All right? So think about various objects. Do I move the same way? Do I make my hand the same shape when I catch a frisbee versus a cricket ball? How fast does a frisbee fly versus how fast does a cricket ball fly? So always be thinking about how do the constraints interact to change the movement pattern that I observe being the watcher. And then also consider if I'm the teacher and the watcher, what am I able to manipulate to change the challenge for the person who's trying to make the catch? Right? How do I make it relatively simple for a beginner? How do I start to make it more complicated? What do I manipulate? So, even if I'm stationary, there's an element of anticipation in trying to be ready for the ball. That becomes even more dramatic if I have to move to make contact with the ball. Whether I'm moving with a hockey stick or a lacrosse stick, or whether I'm moving and I'm looking to try to catch it with my hands, or I'm trying to intercept a ball that's being kicked and I need to intercept it with my foot and pass it on to the next player on the field. Right? So anticipation plays a large role, and learning to anticipate is one of the problems that the brain has to overcome with these kinds of skills. Right? And what we know with the research is that the manipulating part, the closing my hand at the right time, the actual catch of the ball, is likely to be fully developed before the ability to be in the right place to catch the ball. So I have to take that into account as the teacher. They may be catching the ball just fine every time I throw it to them and they're standing still. And then as soon as I try to make it more challenging and they have to move while I throw the ball, and now they start dropping the ball left, right and center, and they get upset because they can catch a ball and now all of a sudden they can't catch a ball. Right? Because adding in that anticipation and being in the correct place makes it much more complicated. Right? We have to be able to initiate the movement early to get to the right place at the right time and intersect. So we see improvement with this idea of anticipation and interception with age, although it does seem to depend upon which kind of constraints we are imposing on the task. So when we look at younger children, we're not talking teeny tinies, we're talking kids who are younger than puberty. So 8, 9, 10, possibly 11-year-olds. Right? The task constraints can make a big impact on the improvement and the success that we see. So, for example, if I increase response complexity, then we see lower success levels with that age group. If I increase the distance to interception, so instead of having to move 1 meter and catch the ball, I make them move 2 meters and catch the ball, success drops down quite dramatically. The size of the ball is a really interesting task constraint. The larger the ball is, the more likely I am to be successful. The smaller the ball is, the less likely. It comes back to Zachary's point. But the larger the ball is, the more likely I am to see hugging or scooping than I am to see them go for the ball with their hands. So they're more successful with a large ball, but it doesn't elicit the movement pattern that I want. So if I run my pre-assessment with the small ball and they do horribly, if I want then to make them feel like they can be successful at catching, I need to transition into using a big ball or a balloon or something quite quickly so that, bless you, so that they can have some success at catching and then gradually go smaller. Trajectory, very important when you're working with younger age kids. High arcs, right? So if the ball is making a big arch, is less successful for younger children because then their brain has to interpret horizontal and vertical movement. And that's more difficult than just horizontal movement. So when I'm working with people who are less experienced or younger, I want to try to keep the ball as flat as I can so that they're not trying to track an arc that they don't have experience with yet.
Even though it's a longer time?
I know, it's interesting, isn't it? And I have to say, I've seen children on like our playground who manage an arc, but I think they're clearly the kids who are doing sport stuff at home and have experience with it. Weirdly enough, object and background color can make a difference with younger children. All right, with 7, 8-year-olds, they do much better trying to catch a blue ball against a white background. If you throw them a white ball and the gym wall is white, then their visual perception isn't distinct enough to be able to cleanly pick out the outline of the ball against the wall. Right? One of the factors there's many factors that play into home advantage. One of the factors that plays into home advantage is that you have experience at picking out the ball against the background that you practice in. When you go away and you play in a new stadium, now you've got to find the ball against all this noise in the background. Right? Different colors, there might be flags flying, you know, the seating is in different positions, or the seating color may be different. Okay. So even as adults, a change in the background can alter my success rate with catching until I have experience in that background. And the speed of the ball, particularly repetition to repetition with young children. You want to try to keep the speed consistent rep to rep. Because if you throw the ball slowly And then on the next rep, you throw it fast. Their brain is going to be getting ready for it coming slowly. And vice versa. If you always throw the ball quite quickly, and then you throw a slow one, that wasn't what their brain was preparing for. Right? So when you have less experience, you want to keep the speed of the moving object, typically a ball, as consistent as you can. Don't change it up. I mean, we all know, right, if we're playing as adults, changing it up is a good thing. Right? Do it in tennis, we do it when we're in football. Right? The more we change it up, the more inconsistent we are, the harder it makes it for the opposing team or athlete. Okay. All right. So we are going to stop there. I have about 4 more slides. Okay. So I will create a PowerPoint with a narrative on it to cover those 4 slides that you can watch Thursday, Friday, as long as you get it done before Monday. Right? Because Monday you need to start studying. I won't be here Monday. You need to start studying. Wednesday we'll have our review. Friday we have exam. Okay? So do not leave watching the lecture until Tuesday. That would be a bad time. Alright?
So on Wednesday's class, we're not doing any slides, we're doing observation
No,
plan.
Wednesday we're going to do observation plan.
Maybe on there?